This is the Saline City Planning Commission. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Will the recording secretary please call the roll?
Young.
Here.
Carroll.
Here.
Fosdick.
Here.
Morrow.
Here.
Beerbaugh.
Here.
Cole.
Here.
Beardsley. Absent. Heft.
Here.
Troika.
Here.
Staff present tonight include City Planner Auerbach, Community Development Director Harrington, Recording Secretary Katnick, and Engineer Boss. Is there a motion on the table to approve the agenda as amended? As distributed?
What would be, well, no, Madam Chair, it would be as amended, correct? Because we're striking agenda item 23-18.
That is correct.
So, but Mr. Peters is here from the festival, so do we want to add that as a brief discussion item at the end of the meeting?
We can, he was going to do it during the public comment period.
Oh, okay, easy enough. Then I'll move to approve the agenda as amended, striking new business item 23-18.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion on the table to approve the meeting minutes of April 26, 2023, as amended or submitted?
So moved.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Public comment. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at this time to make comments. The person is requested but not required to state their name and address for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person. Please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Peters, 509 Springbrook. And I would like to respectfully request tonight that the agenda be amended to reflect the fact that the Celtic Festival would like to withdraw its request to have a Mill Pond Millie signboard at the dam at Mill Pond Park. Let me give you the reasons why. One is that there's bound to be some, after 25 years of being at Mill Pond Park, there's bound to be some confusions that we moved. And having a big sign that talks about the festival in the park doesn't really help that any. So we would rather move that sign out to the fairgrounds where thousands of festival goers will slowly walk by as they get their tickets and really have a chance to read those supporter signs on the big board. Because really, going down US 12 over the dam, trying to read those signs at that distance isn't that effective. So we think our supporters will get more bang for their buck if we do this. So that's the reason we'd like to withdraw that request. And I'd like very much to thank this commission for its 15 years of support for the Celtic Festival. For 15 years, you've been issuing us a sign variance. And this is very important to us all those years because we're trying to get the word out, and that's one of the best ways we could think of. So thank you very much for all that support over all the years. We hope you all come out to see it at our new location at the fairgrounds. Should be a big year.
Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Seeing no additional public comment, we'll open the public hearings. 23-17, application from Danny Beery of Livonia Builders for a preliminary PUD plan and rezone for the Heritage from R3 to PUD to develop 3.11 acres and construct 20 single-family units at 207 Monroe Street, Saline, Michigan, 48176, parcel numbers 18-18-01-170-015. In our packet, we have a report dated May 17th from City Planner Auerbach, report dated May 18th, 2023 from OHM Advisors, and a memo dated May 18th from Community Development Director Harrington.
Absolutely. So it is the Heritage, formerly known as Bison Ridge, which was the last name this project was presented to you under. It is still action item 2317, and then pretty much consistent throughout, besides some minor updates we'll get through. But it is a preliminary PUD and a rezone. Oh, maybe I didn't turn it on. That would be helpful. Hey, there you go. So it is a downtown adjacent property. It is on the east side of Monroe Street, directly adjacent to the cemetery in the People's Park. It is last zoned R3A and denoted as multifamily in the master plan. It was previously supposed to be developed into the Leslie, which was going to be a multifamily community. Some site work began, but the developer ultimately walked away from the project. The city took pitches at a city council meeting earlier this year and ultimately decided to sell the property to Livonia Builders, who are presenting before you this evening. The request is for a preliminary PUD and rezone. Per the last meeting, the Planning Commission shall review the preliminary PUD plan accordingly to the provisions of Section 10.02 through 10.05 of the Saline zoning ordinance. Following a public hearing, the Planning Commission shall recommend the City Council either approve, deny, or approve with conditions. In making its recommendation, the Planning Commission shall find that the proposed PUD meets the intent of the PUD district and the following 4 standards. The proposed PUD density is in compliance with the master plan. For the R3A, they're expected to follow the R2 designation for single-family homes. It would allow them to essentially do they would essentially need 4.5 acres versus the 3.97 provided, but under the master plan, which allows for a higher density of 10 to 15 units per acre, the applicant meets the standard. So the proposed PUD lot standards have a handful of deviations, most notably the minimum lot area size going from 9,800 to 3,500, the minimum lot width going from 60 feet to 35 feet, and as well as the side setbacks and the rear setback being reduced from 50 feet to 35 feet. There is a slight ask for increase in lot coverage going from 30% to 40%. Stormwater implications will result as of that, but I believe our engineer team is working on it with the builder themselves. And then our new deviation based on the elevations provided to us, or the minimum total floor area for buildings, it would be required to be 1,400. The proposed ranges between 1,225 square feet to 1,495 square feet, making it a deviation of at most 145 square feet. Our ordinance regulating building size does delineate between first floor, second floor combos, so we will later ask the developer to provide us specific floor areas for both the first floor and the second floor, as we are unique in regulating that. For the preliminary PUD plan requirements, it's very similar to that of a site plan with some added fun. So the Planning Commission shall review the preliminary and final PUD recommended approval or denial to the City Council with or without conditions based on purposes, objectives, and requirements of the ordinance and standard specifications such as area width, height, and setbacks, natural resources, building location, site arrangement, parking and loading, site access and circulation, safety paths, landscaping, lighting, signs, floor plan elevation, engineering considerations as well. So upon staff review, the preliminary PUD from the 2 people sitting beside myself as well as me, for area width, height, and setbacks, we would like scaled elevations. Proposed first and second floor areas must be specified if requiring a deviation. That goes back to that building area I just mentioned. For parking and loading, identify or confirm that on-street parking on the site plan itself. That will be another topic we touch on here in just a minute. For site access and circulation, the site plan should state whether Risden Drive will be public or private. For landscaping, the Planning Commission should determine whether or not the 100-foot green belt should be required. An applicant must provide an inventory of the existing vegetation and what they intend to remove prior to final PUD submittal. And then lastly, for floor plan and elevation, provides proposed renderings in the PUD plan. These are some of the original renderings they sent, but we just like it attached formally to the document. As far as recommendations go, it is the staff's opinion that the applicant is conforming to sections 10.02C and section 10.06D of the PUD ordinance. I'll show you what those say explicitly on the next slide. Staff would recommend that the Planning Commission waive the green belt requirement. Although the property is being zoned from R3 to a PUD, it is being used for a single-family purpose, and it is fully surrounded by other single-family users and/or public amenities like the cemetery and the People's Park. It would be appropriate for the Planning Commission to inquire more about the building material being used for the exterior of the proposed home, and the Planning Commission should ask the applicant for clarification on the parking situation and determine whether or not on-street parking should be required in this division. For 10.02C, you as the Planning Commission are determining that the intent of section 10.01 is met. I know how we like to hyperlink our requirements. Essentially that they're using a creative use of land for the betterment of the city. Second, that the proposed type and density of use shall not result in an unreasonable increase in the need or burden upon public services, facilities, roads, and utilities. The proposed development shall be consistent with the public health, safety, and welfare of the city. The proposed development shall minimize any negative environmental impact of the subject site or surrounding land in comparison to a conventional development in conformance with current city standards. The proposed development shall minimize any negative impact upon surrounding properties in comparison to a conventional development in conformance with the city standards. And the proposed development shall be consistent with the goals and policies of the city master plan. So this is one of the things you have to evaluate the plan on. Does it meet the 10.02C standards? And then 10.06D, similarly, in relation to underlining zoning, the proposed type and density of use shall not result in a material increase in the need for public services, facilities, and utilities, and shall not place a material burden upon the subject or surrounding land or property owners and occupants or the natural environment. The proposed development shall be compatible with the city master plan and shall be consistent with the intent and spirit of this article. 3, the PUD shall not change the essential character of the surrounding area. And 4, the proposed PUD shall be under single ownership or control such that there is a single person or entity having responsibility for completing the project in conformity with this ordinance. This provision shall not prohibit a transfer of ownership or control upon due notice to the zoning administrator. As for recommendations, it is my recommendation that the Planning Commission recommend approval of the preliminary PUD and rezoning to the City Council with the following conditions. 1, to correct the project description listed on sheet 01 of the preliminary PUD plan. 2, scaled elevations must be provided, as well as first floor and second floor areas identified, especially if deviations are being proposed. 3, the site plan must be updated to specify whether Risden Drive will be public or private. 4, provide an inventory and assessment of the existing vegetation and identify trees that will be removed or preserved. 5, include proposed renderings in the preliminary site plan submittal. 6, items identified by the city engineer or the Saline Area Fire Department must be addressed prior to final site plan submittal. 7, the 10-feet horizontal separation between a few of the existing catch basins and the proposed lines is not feasible. The applicant shall consult and get any necessary permits from Michigan Department of Great Lakes Environment and Energy. I said that incorrectly, Eagle. The applicant shall keep city staff and consultants informed of their correspondence with Eagle. And then lastly, the stormwater calculations shall be updated to reflect the city's new stormwater management methodology. This may change the detention basin sizing. It is understood that the applicant has had concerns with the change in detention basin sizing based on the new standards. It is the city engineer's opinion that the applicant shall detain all on-site stormwater drainage. However, the off-site drainage may be considered a pass-through flow as long as best management practices for water quality are provided. Example calculations can be obtained from the city engineering department. And then number 9, applicant shall address items number 1 through 7 as listed by OHM for the final PUD plan submittal. These were just more record-keeping, housekeeping items. And then going into it, prior to making that recommendation for approval of the City Council with those conditions, I would urge you to ask, inquire more about the building material being proposed for the exterior of the homes. And then the Planning Commission, you should also ask for clarification on the on-street parking situation and then determine whether or not you believe it should be required. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Auerbach or Ms. Boss, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sure, just I can elaborate on a few of Mr. Harrington's points. So a number of the items we listed in our review are, I would call just administrative updates. The specifying the deviations on the plan is essentially just to avoid any confusion down the road, just to show that those were reviewed and approved. But so that could be something that's could be addressed as a condition of approval. The elevations were provided, they just weren't scaled. So that's another update the applicant could make as a correction, could be handled conditionally. As for the renderings, as with the other projects, if they are a part of the proposal and are a basis of your decision, then they should be a part of the formally approved site plan. So when it gets to the final stage, there'll be some, you'll be able to rely on those to review the final elevations. If you're comfortable with those renderings and just I believe the applicant's letter indicated that vinyl siding and they mentioned a shingle style, not necessarily a material, were proposed. If you're comfortable with that, just having those renderings be incorporated into the plan would be adequate. It's up to you whether you want more specific or detailed information. When the plan was discussed at the last commission meeting, the commissioner comments were that the existing vegetation on the site they felt would be adequate for screening, and that the additional greenbelt space wouldn't necessarily be required and could be waived. The child care facility to the south was also discussed, which is why in this version of the plan it includes now fencing and some additional landscaping to offer screening. So in our review, we're comfortable and recommend that greenbelt waiver be granted and that the proposed landscaping and vegetation is adequate. And then lastly, on the point of the road, if the road will be private and will not be dedicated, then the city's ordinances, at least as far as in our review, doesn't have specific standards for private road dimensions. And if there's a past practice, or perhaps that's an engineering specification somewhere, that could be a question for the city engineer. But without that specific standard, then it would come down to just any practical issues that the roadway with on-street parking would create. It would be relatively narrow, even with parking on one side, even with a traffic control requirement such as parking being limited to certain hours of the day. There's some logistical concerns with simply enforcing that. That'd be a question for the fire department, whether or not, or police department, if they could enforce that. Otherwise, it would be a matter of the HOA enforcing it, which may become challenging later on. While it's reasonable to try to provide on-street parking for guests, that each dwelling will only have typically 2 off-street parking spaces. It's reasonable to think there will be some need for on-street parking. However, at this point, there are some, just like I mentioned, practical challenges to consider. The next of which being trash collection. If there's vehicles parked on the street on trash day, how will be ensured that they're moved so that trash pickup can occur, things like that. So that's all questions you could raise to the applicant. There is no specific zoning requirement for the on-street parking, so it comes down to practicality and safety concerns.
Great, thank you.
I would weigh in on the road width as well. If it's public, the ordinance states it should be 32 feet wide. 27 feet is quite narrow, and that's 27 feet back of curb to back of curb. So when you take out the curb, you're left with 26. Usually a parking lane is 8 feet wide. That leaves you with 18 feet, which is only 9-foot passing lanes, which means an Amazon truck and a garbage truck can't pass each other. It would feel very tight having a car parked on the side and having 2 cars trying to pass each other. Most of the passing lane, or most of the drive lanes you see are between 11 and 12 feet wide generally. So there is some practicality there to be considered.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have questions for? Yes, please.
When you mentioned the retention or detention basin, the request had been that they would ask that we use the past sizing of it, which was like 43,000, but they're proposing 42 now, based upon whatever the engineering thing is. Is your recommendation that we actually look for the new standards to be applied?
Yes, in talking with Engineer Humphris from the City Engineering Department, she would like to see that all site plans start to match the approved standards that are coming in the next month or so, as they will likely be in place by the time this is finally approved. It does result in some increase, but that being said, if you allow the off-site flow to pass through into the Monroe Street sewer, which as there's no flooding issues there, as long as it's treated for water quality before it reaches there, that shouldn't be an issue. The increase is very minimal. I have not seen specific calculations from the engineer yet, but based on my assumptions, it was under 10,000 cubic feet that needed to be added. It was more like 5 or 6.
So how do we achieve that? Does that mean they have to dig it slightly deeper, or when you said pre-treated, what would that involve?
So pre-treatment could be bioretention swales, infiltration trenches. It could be riparian buffers, grass buffers, just something to slow the water down enough to let some of the sediment settle out and kind of increase the quality of that water. Usually that goes through infiltration or bioretention somehow.
And that'll be what would be something our city staff managed to work out with the engineers, yourself, or whatever?
Correct.
Okay. One of the things about this proposal is I think there's more green space than there was with the previous one, considering the larger buildings and the parking lots and such. So I'm hoping that we have less impervious surface than we had previously. So what you're proposing makes sense to me.
The previous site plan also detained all of that off-site flow. So with the new standards, because of the soil types and things like that, the increase, we're letting them pass that through because otherwise it is quite a substantial increase in flow or in detention volume.
The fence, which you had mentioned on here, is that going to be right on the line against the parking lot for property adjacent to it, or will they have the ability to put their own vegetation or screening? I just concerned about seeing a large fence just stuck in the middle between the two locations and how that would look.
It is right on the property line. It runs the length of units 1 through 6, and I believe they included a detail that'll be 6 feet in height and vinyl material.
And you had made recommendations, I know, about more greenery and that type of thing. Would that be something, you prefer the fence this way, or would you recommend a fence set back with some greenery on the other side of it?
Well, given the concern of headlight glare, as long as it's something completely opaque and at least of an adequate height to block or screen from headlights, that is the only recommendation I would have on specifically what it is.
And then the other one, of course, I've mentioned it, the commission, I believe, and the others. Risden Drive already exists. That's a drive that goes into Pleasant Ridge School. So my recommendation would again be to potentially look at a more historical name instead of Risden. And I've come up with a couple. One is Nissley, N-I-S-S-L-E-Y, which is the original owner of that property when it was a hatchery back in the turn of the late 19th century. Or Maud, or Annin, A-N-N-I-N, which was another historical name that was related to property in that area. Just for a suggestion, I understand they looked at our website and saw that Risden Drive already exists, and to have those two, especially when it's connected to a Pleasant Ridge school, would be too confusing for the community. And then lastly, when you talk about building materials, will that not be part of the condo association agreement in terms of what they need to maintain? And I'm assuming, because we normally see that as a condition, because this will be a condo development, correct?
That's correct. So that in part would be a question for the applicant of what I would, based on the letter that they provided, it sounds like each owner will be responsible for the dwelling and lot, and that there really won't be any common element that the HOA would need to maintain. And further, the HOA would not be maintaining the dwellings, was my understanding. But again, you could ask the applicant. And as far as the materials specifically, they've, like I said, just mentioned that there will be vinyl siding, and that you would need to look up the term for the style of shingles just to show some material variation in the elevations. If you're comfortable with that, then that's your prerogative. The only design standards that apply are just have to do with very general consistency with adjacent structures. So if you're comfortable with the renderings and just the very brief description are adequate, then that's all that needs to be done.
Yeah. And then, I mean, I would probably refer back to Vanessa Court, and the stylings of those homes would be some of the materials and designs that Danny Berry has already produced. So if that's similar to what we're going to see on these houses, I think that's acceptable. And then lastly, the on-street parking. Because this has been an issue with council, and I understand it, there's concern that any overflow parking is going to go into the People's Park parking lot, and potentially where we're putting the fence to block the headlights. So somehow I'm wondering how we can achieve that, which is interesting because we just had a presentation before council that talked about narrowing the streets. And your concern is exactly what I mentioned, was that you can't get a truck and a delivery vehicle passing each other. But in this situation, if it is a private road, that's more of a responsibility of this development than I would be worried about for the city if it's a public road. So whatever you mentioned on that, that's just to my point. And for that question. And then lastly, as we talked about, if each individual home is going to be its own thing and they kind of maintain it themselves, how does that address the streetlights? Because it sounds like streetlights are going to be, the lights were going to be on all the buildings and not in the streetlights. And if their owner is responsible for each one of those houses, how does that get maintained and how is that resolved so that all those lights are working and functioning as a safety feature, which we normally require of any development?
That would be a question for the applicant.
Thank you.
mentioned that each unit has 2 parking spaces.
Yes, so one would be in the garage, and then one would be in the driveway, except in the cases where they're proposing a 2-car garage, and then it would be 3 parking spaces, so 2 in the garage and 1 in the driveway.
Is it possible to widen the driveway, to put 2 in the driveway? I mean, you know, parking is going to be an issue. And if you have anyone over, you know, an extra parking space is really valuable. So is it possible to make the driveway a 2-car, double width?
Given the width of the lots are only 36 feet, I mean, that would result in the majority of the front yard being driveway.
Well, if the homeowner is, if that's okay with the homeowner, is that okay?
I don't believe it would be prohibited by any lot coverage requirement.
Right, it would meet the lot coverage. I believe it actually would technically meet the yard requirement, and the driveway width we cap at, I believe, is 27 feet. Let's just recite that off the top of my head. So if it looks like the current driveway, if I'm not mistaken, is around at 12 feet. I don't have the number in front of me right now.
So if we conclude that on-street parking is beneficial to this development, then can we make that a requirement even if it is a private road?
That on-street parking should be
Yes.
provided? I believe we, could you require on-street parking in this?
Well, I think it would tie back to the PUD standards, and I think there could be a reasonable basis for it, given that I believe there's no available on-street parking in the vicinity. Just the question is, where could it go? First, if it is proposed, or however it's decided, it would need to be shown on the plan. And then you could get into the specifics of how to avoid any logistical issues. But I would start with making that recommendation to the applicant. They provide some.
Is it possible to widen the road at the entrance there? Create more parking spaces?
One of the sides of the road is butted up against a retention pond, or the current existing.
What about the north side?
The north side is partly paved by the neighboring property, so there is the potential, but I believe that would be a question best addressed by the applicant. But I do believe, to Mr. Auerbach's point, that we could require them, because it's a PUD, because we're reviewing it in its totality to make sure that the development is relatively self-contained, that we could require them to provide on-street parking. But I think there'd be logistical concerns, and I think that, once again, that question is kind of best directed at the applicant to figure out what their vision of the parcel is.
Director Harrington, I know that, correct me if I'm wrong, that we're in the process of developing engineering standards for the water main roofing. Is that correct? Okay, so how does that impact this plan? If they've given a preliminary, it's not included as far as when they come to us with final plan, how does that work as far as, is it grandfathered in, or is it something we'll eventually require?
So I believe it would be grandfathered in or considered legally non-conforming, but if Ms. Boss has anything to add.
Knowing that this would be a dead end with a number of homes on it, it's not as much of a concern for a loop. It's more water stagnation. So once the homes are built and occupied, it won't be such an issue.
Any additional questions?
What is the issue with the existing catch basins? I don't understand 10 feet from what line?
So Eagle requires 10 feet from storm sewer and water main and sanitary sewer, that whole bit. Because of the way they're constructed, catch basins are generally wider than a normal pipe. So usually it's center pipe to center pipe. Depending on what Eagle reviewer you get, they've been cracking down on that more, where the way the catch basin bumps out, it doesn't meet that 10 feet to the center of the water main. So we'd had to do this in a number of communities. It's a simple variance, especially since they're already installed. I don't anticipate any issues. It is just an extra step you have to get through with your Eagle reviewer.
And one more question. At what point in this process does the developer or the city make a decision as to whether to apply to dedicate the road to the public?
It would be probably now in this process. We would hope to have that resolved hopefully by the end of this meeting.
Well, if I may, that's a very good question, Mr. Troika, because there have been several examples that I could cite over the past 2 decades where developments were conceived with the intent of roads remaining private. and then 5, 10, 15 years after inception, they came to city council asking for their streets to be dedicated. So to that point, and I've talked to the city manager and some of my colleagues about this, I hope to present to city council a resolution sometime this summer to address this issue. I don't have a particular problem with private streets. My problem is 5, 10, 15 years down the road, those residents or that HOA or condo association asking for the city to dedicate the street, make it public, and then it becomes a liability for myself and my colleagues. So what I hope to accomplish via resolution is just to say, if it's private, it stays private in perpetuity. If you want it to be public, you build it to our standards, and we will accept it as a public street upon completion of your project.
Absolutely. I don't think Engineer Humphreys or myself would recommend a road that does not meet our standards to become a public road at a later date. I know there's a political implication to that, obviously, but from a professional standpoint, if it's not built to 32 feet wide in this particular instance, then it really should not be accepted.
Correct. And I'm simply saying the developer and the petitioner can make that decision when we're going through the planning and zoning process. If they want it to remain private in perpetuity, if that's what they're proposing, fine. Just let's be clear that years down the road, city council is not going to be in a position to consider dedicating it because it's just an additional liability that we shouldn't have to assume.
Now, am I understanding correctly that the road width here would not meet our current standard?
Correct. For a public road, it does not meet our standard of 32 feet. I believe that's the current
Okay.
standard.
And
So
the city has not accepted a private street public that is less than that 32 feet.
Not to my knowledge.
not to mine either. There might be.
To my knowledge, I know we haven't, because we have two examples of that being in Woodland, or Wildwood, I should say.
I was thinking more of Maple Oaks. I don't know.
Maple Oaks, and also Cascade Point.
But so to answer your question, Mr. Troika, so it would be ideal for them to label it as private. We believe that the road is intended to be private. It's just not labeled on the site plan. But yeah, that's something that needs to be settled by the end of this meeting for sure.
Will the fire marshal weigh in on things like on-street parking? Because you're going to have a circulation issue if it's too narrow.
Right, absolutely. I think that's a question that we can take up with Fire Chief Spurley.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
As you mentioned about the driveways, is it possible that we can, or I don't know, maybe it already is that way, if you would limit the size of the cement pad in front of the house to the width of the house?
We could add that as a condition of the PUD, I believe.
At least that way you have some green space on the side of it, but it would still allow for at least 2 parking spaces if they wanted to.
If there would be the space for the parking, I mean, why essentially expand the driveway width to along the front of the house? You could take that up with the applicant, and we need to check on the dimensions to see if 2 vehicles could fit side by side.
Anything else to add?
Thank you very much.
I move to acknowledge receipt of the memo dated May the 17th, a subsequent one dated May the 18th, and a third dated also May the 18th.
All in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. It's not listed on the agenda, but we will allow 10 minutes for comments from the applicant. If you would like to come up and speak.
Hello, my name is Evan Priest. I'm the engineer responsible for the plans on this project. Mr. Very, unfortunately, is out of the country and can't be here tonight to talk about this. I know he presented before, so hopefully you've heard what you wanted to hear from him. I do know, that, he intended for these roads to be private. And to discuss the issue of parking, I understand the city's width requirements to be 32 feet. And I agree that 27 feet is pretty tight to allow parking on one side of the street. However, it is commonly done in many places, and I'm sure many of you have driven down those roads. Somebody's coming, maybe you have to duck in front of somebody's driveway and wait for them to pass. In this particular case, it's a very tight site with what Mr. Very wants to do here and what we've tried to put on these plans, and an additional 5 feet of pavement I don't think he wants to do. And given the fact that the road is really only about 500 feet long, I don't really anticipate a lot of conflicts, you know, if you see somebody come in, you're probably going to wait in your driveway to back out and go out. I would say, you know, in acknowledgement of that, maybe a good compromise for that would be to not allow on-street parking on the end in the hammerhead, so that you were sure that a garbage truck or a delivery vehicle would not be impeded from turning around in that location. I think that might be a good compromise for that. Not sure what other issues did.
Do you want to talk about building material?
Building material, yep, he sent me some samples. Some samples of the shingles, which he told me he's going to offer that black one and the weathered wood and the driftwood. Do you want me to circulate this or bring it up?
We'll start with Mr. Troika.
Driveway widths, I think we drew them as 12 on here, which is really only sufficient for one car. I can tell you that from personal experience. I wish mine was 16. 16 is typical for a two-car wide. So I think really you'd have to add 4 feet to the driveway to have 2 cars park in the driveway, which might not be the whole front of the house, but given that the houses are pretty skinny, it might be a little, might dominate the front yard. But you might have people who want to propose that later on after they move in, too. I know a lot of people in my neighborhood have.
Are there any questions for the applicant?
One
Yes.
comment, if I may. My colleague mentioned the street name. It is confusing, since there already is, I believe, a Risden Drive in Saline, adjacent to, or it's used as an entrance and exit point to Pleasant Ridge Elementary School. So I would recommend, that's easy enough to change the name.
I'm sure Mr. Very had no problem with that. I actually threw it in Google Maps to see if that was the case, and it didn't come up with anything, so I'm sorry I didn't catch that
That's all right.
earlier.
I
but
appreciate you, we're trying to
We're,
recognize our founders, so thanks, Lily.
We're happy to take your suggestions, and I'm sure he will have no problem with that.
Thank you.
Any questions for the applicant? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, I know,
Oh.
I did have one question, sorry.
Sure.
The one about the lights, when we talked about the condo responsibility,
Oh, yeah.
how is that going to be assured that it goes, is each condo going to be its own responsibility, or is it going to be part of the HOA in terms of how it handles it?
Yeah, so each condo, essentially each lot would be the owner's responsibility. If you look at we drew basically lot lines, but it's a condominium development. The condominium association would be responsible for common areas, the road, any other private utilities. So you'd still be responsible for your own yard. And typically, in this sort of development, you have the master deed and the bylaws will outline. You also mentioned architectural considerations. There, I'm sure, will be restrictions in the bylaws to what sort of modifications you can make to make sure it's in keeping with the original intent of the elevations you're looking at, the materials and that kind of thing.
It's just how the lighting's going to.
And the lighting, yeah, sorry. The lighting, I know Mr. Very told me he was going to put some kind of automatic on lights on the garages.
Locals have to be independently wired, or? will
I believe he's going to build them that way, so that's just how they are. Then if they go out, I think the HOA would have to just be on you to replace the bulb.
Okay.
But I don't think you're even able to turn them off, is my understanding.
Yeah. So there might be some kind of condition that we have to put in it, so thank you.
I'm sure that would be in the bylaws for the association to enforce if that was the intent.
Okay.
Commissioner Gearbaugh, we also just discussed there's a way to establish a condition that we could then follow through. The owner must maintain the lights and operating condition, and then we could follow through with using code enforcement as well. So you either have the HOA hold them accountable, the city could, we could nest it because of its importance too, to make sure there's two factors of accountability there.
Yeah, just to to make sure and protect the city from liability potentially because of security and safety. Thank you.
And you typically review bylaws at probably the final site plan, right?
Yes.
Anybody? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I'd move to open the public hearing at 7:40, affording members of the public an opportunity to speak to this issue.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes.
There's no one who wishes to speak, Madam Chair, I'd move to close at 7:41.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Comments or questions from Planning Commission members? Yes.
I don't want to belabor the parking issue, but one other question I had is that if you put two cars, or I see there is a sidewalk here in this drawing, but if you put two cars end to end and basically went over the sidewalk, being this a private street, does the city, is that a violation on a private street if you do that? I know it's a violation on a public street, but if you block the sidewalk, is it on a private street?
I believe there would be some issues with the HOA on that front, but I'm not positive it would technically be something the city could intervene in.
It does look like there's a few feet of lawn between the sidewalk and the curb.
Right. So I mean, if they park two cars end to end in the driveway, the second car overlapping the sidewalk and the front, you know.
Oh, do you mean perpendicular to the roadway, encroaching into, okay, so they did, two cars in line, I mean, that would likely be,
The rest of the street.
I would think it would be in the street. Yeah, they did shift the house, the way the houses were sited to provide a full 20 feet in the driveway, so we can at least fit one car, but I would
mean,
think.
two smaller cars could definitely do it, but you would cross the sidewalk. So my question is that a violation on a private road?
It would definitely be an HOA violation. The overhang would be, and if it impedes traffic, there might be a larger concern there.
It would impede pedestrian traffic.
Er-
I don't know about.
You may also be in conflict with ADA requirements at that point.
Okay. So yes, essentially there would be multiple levels or layers there that would kind of kick in if that were to happen. I think you'd have a real hard time stacking two cars without obviously being in violation of something.
So would the HOA have to patrol that, enforce it?
Yes, and then if there's an ADA violation, there's potentially an escalation aspect there. It would go necessarily to the city, but.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Couple things. Looking at the, lots 10 through 14, is there sidewalk in front of those?
No, sir.
So when we just mentioned ADA, is there a concern there with that?
Oh, no? Okay, I would defer to the city engineer on that, but I think it would certainly be best for sidewalk and a striped crosswalk to be added.
And then also, the issue with the entrance, where the property, there may be a dispute over the property line and where it's paved and where it's at, I think needs to be resolved either through negotiations here between that property owner and Mr. Beery or the city or whatever, because I don't want to see something inherited that is a perpetual problem that may just become an issue in the future.
I think the applicant has.
I think I can address that. There's actually an existing easement for that driveway on this property, so they have rights to use that. The easement is not defined by any described piece of land, so it just is where it already is, and we intended to just let them leave it there. I looked at it, and it doesn't really look like there's much of a modification we could propose to them where they could still use it how they want to use it, so we just thought we'd leave it where it is and leave the easement as it is.
It's a recorded easement?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it just doesn't say it's over this specific piece of property, so.
No, as long as that's out there clarified, if we don't
Yep.
come back to that, thank you very much.
Yes.
I don't want to exacerbate the parking issues that will likely exist on this site, but I do agree and like the recommendation from the petitioner to essentially eliminate or ban on-street parking on the hammerhead on the back end of the cul-de-sac. I think not only from an emergency vehicle perspective, but also from larger trucks, UPS, Amazon that deliver, that would provide them a way to turn around or back out of Risden, what is now known as Risden Drive, in the event that there's excessive number of cars on the street. So I thought that was a good suggestion. I would support that.
Yes.
And I believe we all agree private streets and then parking if possible. Because otherwise, my suggestion would be is then widen the driveways to 16 feet, which would then make that a requirement so that then you do have, besides the garage, 2 more spaces in front of those properties.
Right, I think it is possible, and like I said, it would be tight, but it is indeed possible to have on-street parking on Risden Drive up into the Hammerhead, if that's the planning commission's preference.
On one side.
On one side, yes, yeah. I don't think you could.
It has to be limited to one side, or you won't get a fire truck through there.
Do we have an idea of how many spots, parking spots that would be?
On the north?
I would do it on the north side, right?
I mean, 500 feet minus whatever the hammerhead is, it's about 20 feet a car usually.
The space between drives is 21 feet, I believe, and the applicant's letter indicated that the spaces would be the side of the street opposite the hydrants, which I believe is the north side. So that would be five spaces in between the driveways of units 15 and 20.
You might get another 3 or 4 in that 100-foot stretch with the sidewalk.
Right, and there is, could be another potential if there is, if a portion of the road could be widened to provide some additional spaces.
So we're thinking at a minimum 8 spots on the street.
And there are, as you said, there are no standards for it, or is a recommendation from?
I don't believe so. For, in the case of a condo development, private road, there none that I'm aware of. But the city, through the engineering office and the fire department do have discretion to cite safety concerns.
Mike, so where would you widen it, though, to get back to your previous point?
If there were some room in between, on the north side, in between unit 20, and the sidewalk would need to be adjusted, I'm not sure. I mean, that's the only spot where maybe there is some room to play with, but I'm just throwing the idea out there.
Do you have to have the buffer behind, from the back of curb to the front of sidewalk? Could that be eliminated?
The
Tree lawn, the Michiganders like to call it.
That's,
The tree lawn extension. The lawn extension, tree lawn, I hear a lot.
I don't see why not.
I mean, that could provide, what, 3 additional feet through there on one side of the street or the other, or both. I mean, some communities won't allow you to abut to the back of curb with sidewalk, but I just didn't know if that was something in Saline that we had to have. I mean, if we're trying to widen the roadway, that would be an optimal place, at least on the tangent portion of this.
I'm not familiar with any standard, so we would have to get back to you on that specific. We can always establish a condition here too that we recommend that with the condition that the applicant establish a minimum of 8 on-street parking spots and work with community development engineering staff to find best practice for that.
Well, I would agree with that, but I think the goal would be to try and create more.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I can already see the issues with 8 spots for 20 houses with 2 spots for each house.
Yeah, I would like to get us in like the 15 range myself.
Which would be, from my perspective, would be is increasing those ramps to 16 feet where you can park 2 cars.
The driveways?
Driveways, yeah.
So yeah, I think there are a variety of solutions. It might be on some homes widening the driveway off the bat. It might be adding some on-street parking off the bat as well. So, or at minimum of 8, I would say a minimum of 8 is what we can, eyeballing it, that's accomplished. So I think it's just a matter of working with the applicant before we bring you back with the final.
Anything else?
Did we answer all your questions, Mr. Harrington?
I believe so, yes.
Is there a motion on the table to recommend to City Council to approve, not approve, or approve with conditions? Could also add conditions as we discussed.
Yeah, I'll move to recommend to approval with conditions. The 9 are enumerated, and then the 10th would be in reference to parking. And Mr. Harrington said the first part of that condition really well. Do you want to re-articulate that?
If I can manage to pull it out again. So it was that the applicant shall work with city staff to provide a minimum of 8 on-street parking spots, as well as to find other ways to increase guest parking, essentially.
I'll second that if I may modify the condition number 3 that the site plan will be updated to specify a private, will be private.
That was my second point, so I'm glad you caught that.
And,
That's okay with that.
and would we like to add a condition about eliminating parking on the Hammerhead?
Yeah, I believe that would be,
Yes.
Since you made the motion.
Could you add to that condition to eliminate, to prevent on-street parking and provide signage for that as well? Because I believe that would be a critical aspect. If you see parking in one area of the subdivision, it's not signed, you can't in another, that would definitely be a problem.
Okay.
We need to reference, or do we need to mention that we desire that the name be changed?
Yeah, we could add an additional condition that the road name be changed.
Yeah. And then another one condition, required sidewalk along lots 14 through 10.
Would add and striped crosswalks.
And striped crosswalks to attach to the other portion of the drive.
So my motion then would be, Mr. Gearbaugh modified item 3, I added 10. 11 is the change in street name, and then 12 is sidewalks in front of the,
There's also an additional, sorry to add to it, the additional condition to not allow, there shall be no on-street parking in the Hammerhead.
I thought we were including that in item 10.
10, okay, that makes sense then.
Mr. Morrow, are you okay with the conditions as moved?
Yes, ma'am.
Who's second?
Yeah, just one other clarification. Do we need to put a condition on the lighting arrangement, or is that, are you comfortable enough without having to do that?
I don't know if we need to do that at this time. It's something because of its size. It could be captured at the final PUD if it's not clearly already outlined in the bylaws by the time we review it.
I'm good with that then. Thank you.
Great.
So is Gearbaugh the second?
Yes.
Okay.
Any additional discussion?
Just a quick comment. This is not necessarily to disagree, but is there really a need for a sidewalk at 10 through 14? Because it strike me as a place where you would have pedestrian traffic. You're not going from there to any other public space. Just throwing that out there as a question. I suppose our recommendation is open-ended and it can be considered by council. But from a planning perspective, I'm not sure I see the need for that.
You're walking from one house to the next.
Well, you do that, sure, but
And under ADA, I believe that would be a requirement if our consultant was mentioning that.
Yeah, the way it's drawn right now, you're missing receiving ramps and level landings on the end of that street. You can't just open-end it into a street without a place to cross and turn around on the other side.
you're referring to the sidewalks in 10 through 14? Okay.
So the sidewalk that comes across in front of 9 and 15 would need receiving ramps and level landings on the opposite side of the street in front of 13 and 12, essentially. So that you have a place to cross, turn around, and come back if you're a wheelchair user.
It may require a redesign of number lot 13 because it's right into the driveway.
You could potentially wrap the sidewalk around the end of the hammerhead and then come across 14 through 10. We'd have to work with the applicant on the spacing on that, though.
Right, I think the driveway on 13 would potentially be flipped. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for, but that's not a substantial change in my opinion.
All right, we have a motion on the table, moved by Mr. Morrow, seconded by Councilor Gerbach, to recommend with approval, to recommend to City Council to approve with conditions 1 through 13? Is that what we?
I had 12.
I have 12.
12, good. All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Since new business 23-18 has been removed from the agenda, are there any discussion items?
Since there are none, Madam Chair, I'd move to excuse the absence of our colleague, Mr. Beardsley.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. And anybody, I will move to adjourn the meeting at 7:55 PM.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Have a great night.
Do we need to sign?
Yes, please sign the.
Thanks,
Yes,
Jim.
please sign the site plans.
Dan, will you mention? What'd you say?